Hello everyone, my name is Kirill Nekludov, and in this video I would like to tell you about our recent paper, which is called Computational Framework for Solving Wasserstein Lagrangian Flows. The plan for this video is the following. First, I would like to discuss some basic ideas of classic Lagrangian mechanics. Then I would like to reintroduce these ideas on the space of distributions. After that, I'll discuss the main development of this paper, which is the computational framework that finds the optimal trajectories under the Lagrangian formalism. And finally, we'll discuss some applications and results for the single-cell biology data. The main idea of Lagrangian mechanics can be described as follows. Let's say we have a particle that goes from point x0 to point x1, and of course there are many possible paths that it can take, but we introduce some notion of optimality, some loss over these paths, over these trajectories. This function here, L, is called Lagrangian, and it depends on the coordinate, on the position of our particle at time t. It depends on its velocity as well, and maybe it changes in time, so it depends on time. And we integrate this Lagrangian over the entire trajectory from time 0 to time 1. In physics, this function is called action, and the optimal trajectory should follow the principle of least action. So it should minimize, it solves essentially this optimization problem. It minimizes this integral of the Lagrangian, subject to the constraint that the trajectory agrees with the velocity, so the time derivative of the trajectory equals to the velocity, and it satisfies the boundary conditions. The simplest example would be just the kinetic energy, the Lagrangian that consists only of the kinetic energy. It doesn't depend on the coordinates. The problem then becomes as follows. We simply substitute this Lagrangian and into our equations, and we integrate this kinetic energy subject to the conditions. And if we solve this optimization problem, we will see that the optimality condition is that the acceleration along the trajectory equals 0. So the particle has to follow the straight line with the constant speed. A bit more complicated example would be to introduce, to consider some particle in a potential well, let's say. So this is like a potential, this is like a landscape of our potential energy. And the potential energy goes into the Lagrangian with a minus sign. So this is the kinetic energy minus the potential energy. The optimization problem, of course, becomes as follows. And once again, doing the same machinery as before, we can find the optimality condition. And the optimality condition is that the acceleration along our trajectory has to be minus a gradient of the potential energy. So this is essentially the second Newton's law. And the optimal trajectory is going to be different. So it's going to be some curve. Now let's move to the Wasserstein Lagrangian mechanics, which is the same formalism, but on the space of distributions. The Wasserstein Lagrangian mechanics allows us to consider many different dynamics, many different problems from the single perspective. Namely, it tells us that all of these dynamics are the instantiations of the same problem, but with a different Lagrangian. And to see this, let's now look at the case where we have a number of particles. Let's say that the green particle goes from here to here, and the red particle goes from here to here. And of course, we introduce the Lagrangian, but nothing really changes because we can just independently solve these problems for every particle with its own Lagrangian, and this is just the same problem repeated many times. However, if we remove the colors and now we consider that this set of particles move to this set of particles, but we don't really know where every particle goes, we can say that we move distribution of particles. So we start from some initial distribution with the density q0 of x, and we end up in the final distribution q1 of x. And we also have to introduce some notion of optimality, and we do it through Lagrangian. So the simplest possible way to do it is to average, for example. We will simply average the Lagrangian, we'll simply average the kinetic and potential energies over the distribution of particles, qt of x. And now let's see how this classical formalism transfers to the formalism of distribution. So before we had our simplest problem with the kinetic energy, so where the Lagrangian is the kinetic energy, and now we have the Lagrangian that depends on densities, the change of density, and now it's simply the average of the kinetic energy. Before we had the following optimization problem where we optimize over x of t, v of t, our trajectory. And here we also optimize over the trajectory, but the trajectory in the sense of marginals, the densities. So qt of x is our density at time t, and vt of x is our vector field at time t. Of course, we have to make it all consistent. So the time derivative of the trajectory equals to the velocity. But here, the same role is played by the continuity equation, so that describes the change of the density for the given vector field vt of x. And before we had the marginal conditions, the boundary conditions that the trajectory starts at x0, x1 and ends at x1. But now we have the conditions on the marginals, which means that our initial marginal is pi 0 of x, and the final marginal is pi 1 of x. And thus we just formulated the Benamou-Brunière formulation of optimal transport, for instance. So this Lagrangian that we considered corresponds to the optimal transport, and if we write down the optimality condition, it will tell us that every single trajectory in these distributions has to follow a straight line with a constant speed, because the acceleration is 0. So this corresponds to this animation that transport the marginal blue particles to the orange one along these lines. Of course, we can now simply add the potential energy. Here it is. It's minus v of x. And the optimality condition is going to be, as we've seen already before, that every particle follows Newton's second law. For example, it can be something like this, where the particles now have these accelerations, so they follow some curves. And to get some intuition, you can think about this as the rules of the game. So let's say in the optimal transport, everything moves by straight lines. So like queens, they just, on the chessboard, they move by straight lines, and we have to transport these white queens to these black queens. But if we consider a different Lagrangian, we change our chess pieces from queens to, let's say, knights. And of course, the trajectories in our transportation plan, everything will change. So far, so good. We considered different Lagrangians that are averages. So we took the kinetic energy and averaged the kinetic energy for every particle. We took the potential energy and did the same. But what if we take one more step into abstraction? What if we say that the kinetic energy is actually a black box that takes in a distribution and a vector field, which is the change of the density, corresponds to the change of the density, and outputs a scalar number. And the same for the potential, it takes in only a distribution and only outputs a number, also outputs a number. So together, the kinetic and the potential energies define a Lagrangian as well on the space of distributions. And now let's see what we can do with these new abilities. So for example, let's take the kinetic energies before, but for the potential energy, we'll consider something more exotic, let's say. So here also you can see that it's not simply a function of the density, but it's a functional, which means that, for example, we can take derivatives of the density. And here we take the norm of the score of the gradient log density, and we average this norm. And the solution, the optimal solution to this Lagrangian will be a Brownian motion, so which can be simulated as a stochastic process, for example. So this is going to be a Schrödinger bridge now. And if we flip the sign, for example, in the potential energy from minus to plus, and we consider the initial distribution and the final distribution, here it is a 3D distribution with like 3 2D projections. So what's in between is going to be the Schrödinger equation, and we see that just by flipping the sign of the potential energy, we completely change the nature of our dynamics from some stochastic Brownian motion to the laws of quantum mechanics. We can also change the kinetic energy, and here we just get rid of the potential, and for the kinetic energy, we take something like this. So here the function S reweights the particles, and this formulation is the unbalanced optimal transport formulation that allows not only move your particles in space, but also assign some weight to them and reweight the particles along the trajectory. In the end, we get a menagerie of Lagrangians that, through different kinetic and potential energies, define completely different dynamics with completely different properties. And we can use this formalism to incorporate these properties into our problems. Of course, the question now is, how do we solve these optimization problems that we formulated? And we'll do this in our computational framework, which is the main contribution of this paper. So to understand how to solve it is in practice, let's consider first once again the simplest Lagrangian, consisting only of the average kinetic energy, and this is our optimization problem. We have to optimize over all the possible marginals and the vector fields to minimize the action, and thus to find the path with the minimal action. To minimize the action, let's start with estimating the action. Let's first fix the marginals qt, this path qt, and just minimize over the vector field, finding the minimal kinetic energy that finding the vector field with the minimal kinetic energy that satisfies the continuity equation. So we have to solve the following problem, and actually this problem has already been solved by the action matching algorithm. In short, it shows that the vector field has to be a gradient flow of some function st, and this function st can be found as an optimum of the following objective. The interesting property of this objective is that it depends only on the samples. It depends only on the expectations over the density, so we don't need the density, we just need the samples from this density. And the value of this objective is the action that we are looking for. Once we know the action, we can take the infimum of this action across all the paths qt. And expanding, so this term is estimated by action matching, so expanding this, we'll get the following optimization problem, where we take the infimum of what's in the blue box, with respect to the marginals QT. From the geometric perspective, it looks as follows. We have a curve on the space of distributions, and we can estimate the action along this curve. To estimate the action, we use action matching. So it means that we have to find the vector field that acts on the state space, so that we have to find how this vector field pushes the particles around. And then using this vector field, we can estimate the action. Once we know the action for this curve, we can start our outer optimization loop. So that was the inner optimization, but in the outer optimization loop, we optimize over curves. We move these curves slowly, and finally we have to achieve the optimal transport distributional path that would, in the Wasserstein geometry, that would correspond to a straight line. And we can also do the same thing for the multi-marginal constraints. That is, if we're given several marginals and we have to move in between, we optimize in the space of splines in between marginals. In this algorithm, in this optimization algorithm, for the outer optimization, it's very important how do we parameterize this marginal skew of T. And in our paper, we do it as follows. We first sample from the endpoint marginals pi 0 and pi 1. Second, we interpolate between these points using a neural network. So the time t here, it goes from 0 to 1. At time 0, it equals x0. At time 1, it equals x1. But in between, it's very flexible because of this neural network parameterization that takes in time, x0, x1, and has parameters, set of parameters, eta. And then we first optimize over the function S, which is another neural network that defines the vector field. And then we optimize in the outer loop over the function of the parameters eta of our neural network spline Q. And we optimize the following loss. Of course, we can do this simultaneously. We can do one gradient update of S, one gradient update of Q. The important thing here is that the neural network have to be discontinuous. For example, if x0 comes from one mode and x1 comes from another distant mode, the neural network has to be able to make a jump, a discontinuous jump from one mode to another. Otherwise, you can observe such artifacts, and they happen because of the network being a continuous function. Finally, let's move to applications and results. In the single-cell biology experiments, the setup is the following. We are given with the 5 sequential snapshots of the population of cells, and we would like to predict what was happening to cells in between. That's why we remove one of the marginals in between, and then we fit the model to the rest of the marginals, the trained marginals of the population. Then we predict what happened in between by pushing forward the cells from the beginning till some point in time, and then we compare to the left out marginal. Thus, we can estimate the error. We do these experiments for different data sets on different dimensions and for different Lagrangians. And what we see is that some of the Lagrangians allow for a better prediction of the dynamics of cells that happens in between, which is reasonable because there is no reason to cells to follow a precisely optimal transport or Schrödinger bridge. So considering different Lagrangians, incorporating different properties into the dynamics, we can improve the prediction of the dynamics of cells in between. We also evaluate our models for the marginal constraints, so we see how well our models satisfy the marginal constraints. And in order to do this, we just train the model on the full set of marginals, and then we evaluate it by starting from the initial cells and then pushing it forward to the next marginal and comparing the next marginal with the trained data. And we see that our model satisfies these marginal constraints at least as good as all the previous models as competitors. You can learn much more about this algorithm in our paper. You can find the link in the description. In general, this is a framework, computational framework, and like abstract formalism to incorporate different properties into dynamics, such properties as stochasticity, classical mechanics, maybe even quantum mechanics, and death and growth of cells of particles. Thank you so much for your attention. That's it.